Okay, thanks, Drew, and thanks, Gordon, too, for that great overview of what it means to put plants in the ground and maintain a productive enterprise operation. I've worked with Gordon and with a number of people. I recognise some faces, familiar faces around here, up here for quite a while anyway, since the early 2000s, or mid-2000s. Based down the coast, but every time I come up here, it's an absolute pleasure. It's you, Trish. Hello, Trish. And today I just want to try to capture some of the key points from this recent project, which is still running. We've had all types of troubles regarding coronavirus, regarding a whole range of things, but we're here and that's the main thing. And this is about really building on what Gordon produced, connections on your property for wildlife. In this case, I apologise, I'm a bird tragic, but we did put our proposal and our application along the lines of the other animals that could benefit. Quolls closer to the eastern fall, Bell's turtles, there's a lot of reintroduction work going on. There are other species out there, it's not just about birds, Andrew. Which I get reminded all the time. So this is a project that started in 2019, and I worked with some New England Landcare to get this funded, and it relates to a previous project. It builds on a previous project just over the other side of Big Ridge Road here, and that was called Closing the Gap, and it was based on the whole idea of this 25-metre wide gap between, say, the Arding area, of further west, northwest to Balala, and the eastern fall over here, just to our east. So it's about trying to work out how we could provide better habitat for a range of birds really in dire straits. Some of these birds have got so low in population size that they've been classified as threatened species. Okay, and we'll look at some of those. Bear in mind, I'm just saying to Sren, I'll have to keep, just like Gordon, I could probably talk all day on birds. I'll have to keep moving with these slides. So apologies if you don't see all of the detail. There's plenty of opportunity out there in the field, and we're going to my favourite little bit of bush on the northern tablelands this afternoon, or one of them anyway. So let's just have a look at this a little bit more closely. And the area I was just talking about, I should have had this on, sorry. We can see where we are, number 2, we're roughly up around here currently, and that's a little bit of bush I was talking about this afternoon. So we've got 13 properties there that capture a mix of people who've been in Landcare, planting trees, shrubs and ground covers for quite some time. Quite a long time, as you heard from Gordon. Gordon's one of them at Eastlake, Gordon and Wendy. And then we've got the Taylors, of course, tracking way back to Land, Water and Wool Project, Nick Reed and co at UNE in the early 2000s. Okay, and I've also come from UNE, that's where I've studied too. And then Chiswick over here, Cyro, and Andrew, I don't think Andrew Eichhorn's here, but Chiswick is another property where there's been a lot of interesting planting that's taken on over the years. 35-year-old revegetation, bringing back in grey shrike thrush, 3 species of thornbill, etc., moving down from the satellite tracking station right through to the railway line just about. Now, if that's not demonstration of value, then I think we need to look at it again. But I'm happy with that. There's a lot of little sites here. But there's also wetland sites. At the start I said woodland. You might think this project's just about woodland birds. It's not. It's actually about wetland birds too. So apologies there for those with wetlands on their properties. I know at Salisbury Court that's been one of the key properties we've been studying, and I quite often get little reminders from Trish that I saw this and this bird, a Latham snipe and other species, and it's been an absolute pleasure to be out in the field with the landholders for this project particularly. And that's probably half of those properties have been out there with me, given that they've got very busy times work-wise. So we've spanned across. Now, when number 9 is in there, it wasn't technically, it was originally an expression of interest. I think Des from memory and Struan, but that's Hugh and Shelley Cordingley's place at My High Station. That's included because that particular place is so close to the eastern fall edge. And the number of species and the number of threatened woodland bird species there ranked right up there. It's probably number one actually in this project, simply because of where it is and the amount of bush that's being kept on the Trigg Reserve up there and the ram paddock below it.
There's a tiny patch of blue box there, I think, from that My High section, Andrew, is that correct?
Yes, there is too. You're right, Des, and it's Linfield Road, isn't it? I think Linfield Road. There's a strip past the Gates's property, the Performance Genetics place there. So that there are patches, and northern blue box is definitely one of those species. It's not just about birds and other animals. It's about some of our most threatened woodland plant species as well as communities. There's 4 endangered ecological communities up here that we've been targeting in this project. So what's the background? I'm going to skip through this quickly. The background here, I've already mentioned, it's been part of other projects, but tracking back, we're looking at quite a long time. In fact, I think if Karen Zerkler was here right now, she'd probably say, well, no, hang on, Andrew, that's the 1980s. And Peter Metcalf, I think, would... there's been people here that have been a lot longer involved than certainly I have. But it is a nice history, a progression of thinking from these narrow plantings, which, generally they've been very functional for windbreaks, erosion control, very functional, and beautification of properties. And there's also been fencing of woodland patches. That's been going on. Anybody who would remember the name John Duggan would remember that this has been going on since the 80s up here. And in fact, the southern New England part of Australia is one of the leading areas for tree planting, restoration, and thinking about how to get better outcomes for the farm bottom line, as well as to try to hang on to what we've got left and maybe get some back in. And it's a pleasure to be here, Richard, on your property. Okay, so then we've gone through this thinking about, oh, well, they should be a bit wider because very narrow plantings tend to be invaded by quite aggressive competitive species and predatory in some cases, like butcherbirds, aggressive species like noisy miners and so forth, and they put undue pressure or they actually just push out some of the smaller birds, so breeding goes out the back door. Having said that, some smaller birds like thornbill species know how to get around and get under the noisy miner radar, etc. But by and large we've moved to these wider and a bit longer plantings, and there's been this thinking about linking across your landscape. And Gordon mentioned and showed some images there of what's been happening on his property. Not just little patches. There's a lot of little patches here. Over here at Tim's at Stanley Vale where I've worked, there's a lot of patches that reflect small block plantings for different purposes, multiple reasons for plantings, but they're not particularly linked. So from about that time, roughly, we started thinking about, well, how can we link across the landscape to cater for species that are dispersal sensitive? That, when I say that, from a bird perspective, I mean species that are unwilling or unable to cross gaps, 500-metre gaps between that little patch there and that patch up on the hill there. They may not be able to do that. In fact, research shows that there are species and different genders within species, interestingly enough, in the brown tree creeper work, we can talk about this later, where females have been dispersal sensitive, males have been willing to cross those gaps. So you get all these guys in one remnant, and it's just not working for the species survival in that area. So then we've come to a point now where we've got this planned connectivity conservation approach, where we have stepping stones. They're wider, Gordon touched on some of those, and they're longer. And they feature some of the species of plants that are particularly of value to some of those threatened birds, like the speckled warbler, Berseria, Australian blackthorn. Richard, we've talked about Berseria in the past and thought about how that can be introduced into the shrub layer of these plantings. It is tricky from seed. Kentucky Nursery, I know, and others have been working, Armidale Tree Group have been working on how to get species like that in that provide protective refuges for some of these small birds, and importantly nesting sites, so that there's a hope for their persistence over the time rather than disappearing out of the picture. Connecting across parts of the landscape and looking at logs, rocks and native grasses in the plantings. This is not unique, this is happening across Australia, but I believe New England's one of the regions that's leading the way and has been for quite some time, and some in Victoria too. I mentioned the Closing the Gap project, and both projects are about trying to improve or increase the amount of functional habitat connectivity. Now, I'll try to get to that in a next slide, or a slide coming up, what that means. Improving habitat condition, and we've talked about this 25-metre wide gap. What we're doing here in this area, which goes down, as you saw on the site map, for the location down to Taylors and East Oaks and out to Woodstock, the Bashfords there, and across over to Eastlake, and then north up to Chiswick, is we're continuing on further south from where we worked in the Closing the Gap project. So people who've put up with me running around their properties in the Closing the Gap project would be familiar with this landscape and the continued gap down here. We've gone down to Salisbury Plains, Kentucky, and I worked down in Walker too. On another project. So this whole area we've looked more closely at. Waichus, woodland and wetland birds. Somebody had mentioned earlier that they're indicators, I think it was Struan, indicators of the environmental health, the ecological health of the bush you have or you would like back on your property. So I'm just going to have to skip through this, but I know I'll get gonged out. So these are some of the examples. I borrowed that plan from Gordon the right. I apologise for not being able to see it if you're any further back than the first couple of rows, I suppose. But normally I was thinking about grabbing a sheet, putting it up the back and projecting it on the back, but that wasn't going to happen. Sorry, Struan. But basically the bottom left image photo is a 100-metre wide planting of mallee shrubland in Western Australia in the wheat belt, where I've also worked. And that's for a range of endangered and declining woodland birds. I could have added malleefowl there too, but also a rare skink. And that particular planting, I'd love to see it these days, but it's links to key remnants where there are just a few of these birds left in the populations on that property. This is Mount Arlington at Walker. Those who know a bit about Walker, top left. Taken from one of the hills there. I was out with the folk at the time. This is over a long swamp. One of our board members, or ex-board members, and of course Gordon's plan. So different approaches over the last 3.5 decades, as I touched on earlier. Let's get to this idea I mentioned before of functional habitat, I think. Down the bottom, yep. Okay, so let's get to this idea of functional habitat. Functional habitat is a bit like a tractor. If your tractor is loose, it's not running properly, it's not really going to be all that functional. In a bird context, if a remnant or a bit of bush is minus a layer of vegetation, so it's been heavily grazed, it's been a sheep camp. There's a place up here that I've also been monitoring, stringy bark paddock remnant on Chiswick, not far from here, still a sheep camp, heavily grazed. So recruitment of young plants, a lot of compaction. There are a number of issues. I've recommended a fence right around there. Maybe. So it's not functional, it's not providing habitat. In this case here, the new plantings, this is on East Lake, on Gordon's place. The new plantings are not necessarily that functional. They may be functional for pipits, grass land birds, birds looking for insects in the grass, getting their income, as I put it, their food source from there, but they won't be functional for robins, scarlet robins. They may be at the edges, whereas these retained remnants, the snow gum remnant here and the remnant at the top on the hill, were recorded scarlet robins and dusky wood swallows, and I'll get to those in a minute. So the rest of that, I'll let you dwell on that, and you can ask me about that later. But in highly fragmented landscapes, it takes a while. Gordon pointed to 40 years, I think. It takes a while to get these plantings up and running in terms of functional habitat for woodland birds, and it depends on the species of woodland bird too. Some woodland bird species are quite fine. Eastern rosellas, open country, but they use the woodland too for nesting. They're quite fine. They won't need this type of intensive treatment. But for the small ground foraging, shrub foraging, insect-eating birds, they're particularly susceptible to these pressures, and they will need these types of interventions in fragmented landscapes. What are these birds that we're talking about? There's 6 of the best. These are the ones that I often think of as 6 of the best. They're all threatened, classified as threatened under the New South Wales Biodiversity Conservation Act, which is currently being revised, by the way. And they're 2 robins, the scarlet, top left, the flame next to the scarlet, the speckled warbler, which very close. Amazingly, one winter's day I was freezing my fingers off with the binoculars over here. Andrew Eichhorn came up and wondered what I was doing, and I said, well, what I'm doing is my survey, Andrew. Do you want to come and have a look? Yes, he came and had a look, and we saw a speckled warbler just over in a little bit of hawthorn. Now, that's interesting, isn't it? Because yes, and your place too, Trish. That's right. So people often think, well, no, you've got to have blackthorn, you've got to have Cassinia. That's dead finish, one of the dead finishes. The other one is Acacia tetragonophylla. Anyway, but you've got to have those species in place. Yes, it does help. But if you've got hawthorn in the mix, and up here on stringy bark paddock remnant on Chiswick, that's often, along with some of that, down there in the bottom right corner, some of that Berseria and dead finish is all that's there for these birds. And lo and behold, we recorded a speckled warbler, which we think was using a fence line planting to get there and across into Tim Bowers. So, diamond firetail, Gordon mentioned it before, a small seed-eating, ground foraging, but heavily trapped for the caged bird industry. And that's one of the main reasons it's threatened, apart from predation when it's on the ground by a range of predators. The varied Sitella to the right of the firetail. Varied Sitella is a bit of a mixed story. I think it's making a comeback, and I think in not too much further down the track it'll be delisted as a threatened species, because I've recorded on 40% of the woodland remnants in this project. 30%, sorry, which is up a little bit from past projects. There is a crisis. I'm not going to spend too much on this. I've alluded to it already, other than to point out that over here, on the edge of the falls, we have a bird you'd never find out here, spotted quail thrush. It requires continued big bits, 100, 200, 300 hectares of continuous, pretty much intact habitat. With not too many predators, or no, very few predators. I've thrown a mammal in because I happen to like the Rockies. Brush-tailed rock wallaby over there as well, and would not be around the rocky habitats, more cleared areas. Sadly enough, we've lost the hooded robin. Hooded robin was a species that was found in this area, has declined and then disappeared. We're not sure about Jackie Winter, but Jackie Winter comes and goes a bit over at Eastlake, for example. In Bodas still for scarlet robin, great studies there. I don't need to really mention some of that great research by UNE that's happened over the years at Imboda, or Eastwood as it was previously. And speckled warbler in and around Armidale, and back down here, just nearby. Again, I'm not going to spend much time on this because I don't have much time. In fact, I've gone over, so let's just clip past this. But this is just providing, I'm happy to provide copies. I'm happy to provide copies if you like, Stu, and it's up to Southern New England Landcare, of course, but I'm happy to provide copies of any of these, this information here, because I think it's really helps to take it away and read it in a quieter time, less pressured, etc. But all this slide is saying is that brown tree creepers have almost gone. I have not recorded brown tree creeper working up here in 15 years, but they were still around, and west of here is more chance, Kingston Road, etc. Yep, Invergary. Invergary. So that's great. But then look at that landscape. You've got more bigger bits of bush. Yeah. So that's good news, Des. But out in these areas, it just can't come across them. They're too small. They're gone. Hooded robin's story there. This is work by Hugh Ford and Steve Debus and co. And that is a great paper. And it's an easy enough paper to read, even if you're not an ornithologist. It comes from a scientific journal, Biological Conservation, but it really brings, it really gets to the heart of things. Results? Oh, I haven't even got to those yet. I have to go fast. Bird surveys on Chiswick. Look, I've talked a fair bit about this already, okay? This is just a graphical way of displaying some of those. And I'll point out the birds that quickly I haven't spoken about. In Lambing Gully, I've studied that site a fair bit. So the tawny grassbird and the golden-headed sticklers come back in spring, summer to breed. Okay, dusky wood swallows up there too. Here, this is a good one, in the sense that it relates to your property, Richard. That's why it's a good one. No, the other reason is that Richard has thought about, and I hope you don't mind me saying this, Richard, but Richard has thought about the strategic revegetation on other properties and how best to fit that to your requirements here, your production requirements here, but also how best to link with other parts of previous plantings, such as down here, we'll probably see today a planting of several years old. We've got other bits of bush in the distance. And here, this is just a window on the world of no man's land remnant, where white-browed scrub wrens are breeding quite successfully, and we've had yellow robins there in the past. It's a connectivity project funded under this project, and it's just the start of things, now. It's just the start of things because it'll continue on. There's been a long history of farming here, and we see this as a bit of a demonstration site as well. Some of the birds recorded here, I won't go through all of that. They relate a lot to no man's land remnant. I recorded birds before the preparation for these two sites, 3 and 4 under this project for planting, and then after. Or no, not actually after, Richard. They were ploughed but not planted, I think, last September. Yeah, so need to come back and do that again. But the idea is that we have a reference site here of native vegetation. We're very lucky to have it, in which you can see the bolded birds are the special birds. They're either rare or they're quite dependent on good bits of bush, and that's the threatened species, the Sotelo, that's also recorded there. Taylor's Run, I'll skip through this. I don't see Michael here today, so I did all this work and anyway, that's all right. So this was a very equally important piece of work because they've had a long history of planting trees and shrubs, native and exotic. And this time, Michael was going out on a limb, pardon the pun, to get something planned and connective in, linking two remnants, the threatened Blakely's gum, or the endangered ecological community of Blakely's red gum, and white box and yellow box grassy woodland other sites there too. We can talk about that a bit later. Some of the species that came through, early days, these are just species that you wouldn't be planting. You wouldn't be planting, going to all this trouble, expense and effort for Australian white ibis. Or flying over, or the crow, or the magpie, or the galah, or the rosella, as I mentioned. But you might go to this trouble, to get the goshawk back in, and that was actually in one of the remnants nearby, not at that particular revegetation site. Wetlands, just to wrap on now, you'll be pleased to know, Struan. So look, it's been great. People here who have wetlands on their property, they're quite a treasured feature of the landscape, I think, because in that January 21 and January 22 survey, it was after a lot of good rain. Birds had shifted from the inland. We got pink-eared ducks and just the tip of spoonbills. And it's not just about Danger's Lagoon. I surveyed different sites, the reserves, but the private wetlands and some of the permanent streams and farm dams. I had this little dotterel moves around from inland Australia to the coast, occurring on Beatrice and Gary Bassett's farm dam, muddy banks of that dam. And plume whistling duck out there at Trish's as well. And then the grassland birds, the reed warbler, cisticola and grass bird, which are migratory birds in the warm season arriving. Blue-billed duck is a threatened species. Latham's snipe comes from Siberia and China, and it's subject to a conservation agreement with the governments of China, Japan and Republic of Korea. And we have a responsibility to conserve wetland habitat for Latham snipe just as much as we do for blue-billed duck and some of the others there. Hoary-headed grebes are breeding prolifically again out at Billabong wetland, but also on racecourse and Danger's lagoons. So look, thank you very much, and sorry I've just run a little bit over, or I'm talking a bit too quickly. Haven't had any caffeine, so watch me on caffeine.
We do.